Hi, everybody. This is Margie McHugh from MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. I want to welcome you to this webinar. It's the first in a series focusing on issues and recommendations that are being considered by the newly created White House Task Force on New Americans. I want to, Lisa, I hear feedback there. Sorry, I have a little bit of feedback here on our speaker. All right, we're all clear to go. All right, terrific. So here we go. So I want to say that we're just so pleased that we're going to be joined by two colleagues today who have many years of experience in the integration field. Ava Melona, who's co-chair of the National Partnership for New Americans and also the executive director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, and also Amanda Bergson, who's now a senior policy analyst with National Skills Coalition. Many of you know her from her earlier work in Pennsylvania, is my guess. So before we get going, I just want to do a few housekeeping announcements. The first, you can see there, it'll be easy for you to get the slides and the audio from our website. There's the web address. Definitely, please, if you have any problems accessing the webinar or the platform isn't functioning well for you, just contact us at events@migrationpolicy.org. We're monitoring that and able to communicate with you and solve any of those kinds of problems, hopefully. Please definitely use the Q&A chat function on the right of the screen to write down your questions. We'll be monitoring them here and getting them ready for when we move into the Q&A portion to ask them of the different speakers that are appropriate. You can also just send us your questions via email at that same address, events@migrationpolicy.org. So to start with, I'll just say, probably most of you, many of you are familiar with MPI's work, the work of our center, but I just needed to take a moment to say how pleased we are that we have this new opportunity with the federal government where they've opened up this opportunity both for dialogue and more coordinated action around integration issues. It really is the whole reason that we founded this center 7 years ago. We've been very, very interested in the cross-cutting nature of integration issues, and MPI's international program has done a lot of work with other countries, including Canada, Australia, Germany, a number of countries in the European Union, who have been trying to figure out how to make sure that they're seeing their immigration policies as holistically, seeing it as two sides of the same coin, immigration and integration, trying to make sure that their immigration policies are successful for folks at the state and local level, that immigrants and refugees are succeeding, and making sure that there's a lot of feedback and communication across the two areas of the big areas in domestic policy that are affected, and then their national level immigration policy. So you can see it there towards the end of that list of our areas of work, but the governance of integration policy has been a big focus of our center. And we just see this as a wonderful opportunity now that's been opened up with this new presidential memorandum and the creation of this White House task force. So I'll just quickly say a little bit about the presidential memorandum, because you'll be able to find more about this on our website. The official name of it was Creating Welcoming Communities and Fully Integrating Immigrants and Refugees. It was released by President Obama back in November, right around the time that he released the whole set of executive actions around immigration. And I think that because the executive actions creating the DAPA program and expanding the DACA program were very controversial. That's really what's been in the spotlight nationally. But this, I consider this sort of the sleeper issue, and one that it's really great to see how many groups have turned their attention to this and are trying to give good input to the White House around it. For those of you who might not be aware, the presidential memorandum draws from a number of policy proposals that have been advanced by MPI and other key stakeholders for a few years now. Most recently, there was a bill introduced in the Congress, a bipartisan bill, HR 4949, called the New American Success Act, and a number of the provisions of that, most importantly, the attempt to create a permanent staffed White House office that would look at these issues around integration policy was a key feature around that, and that's part of where kind of I guess I'd say that, some of the framework and the infrastructure for this executive order from the president comes from. So the most important thing, or the two most important things that come out of the presidential memorandum are, first of all, the establishment of a White House task force on new Americans, and what it's aiming to do is, first of all, review the policies of all executive departments and agencies to determine how well, to what extent they're meeting the needs of new Americans, and to come up with recommendations to improve that, and then also with developing a coordinated national integration strategy. So the integration strategy is meant to better integrate new Americans and also support state and local efforts to do the same. And the task force is co-chaired by the Director of the Domestic Policy Council and the Secretary of DHS. And then I think there's about 16 federal agencies and offices that are named directly as participants in the task force. So the other critical thing that the memorandum orders is the creation of a national integration plan within 120 days. So that's been the cause of a lot of this energy that a lot of you and we have been part of, with trying to help folks weigh in on what's going to be submitted to the president. The 120 days would be up roughly Friday, March 20th. It's looking like somewhere by the end of March that plan will be put forward from the task force to the president. So what many of you may have seen already, this new web page that we put up on our website that contains both information about the actions, the memorandum itself, as well as more links to information about the inputs that a lot of other organizations contributed. But basically, this public input process that invited groups to share recommendations for actions or perspectives on different integration issues that they were seeing is what, I think the thing that most folks have been organizing around the last month or two related to this. So in terms of the substance for this webinar, it's probably going to be the most difficult of the ones that we do, because the adult education and training system just is so essential for supporting integration in so many different spheres. So one of the things to be aware of is that since the beginning of the first term of the Obama administration, there's been an interagency working group that was looking at integration issues, and they used a frame of linguistic, economic, and civic integration for their work. And so that language has carried through to a lot of the efforts that you may have been aware of over the last several years, but also particularly to this memorandum. So if you think about that as the overall structure, then, it's easy to see that English language and literacy skills are cutting across all of the integration pillars because of their importance for navigating everyday life, for advancing in the workforce, also for naturalization and broader civic engagement. So that makes this complex enough already from an instructional perspective for those of you who are running programs who are on the phone right now. But then I think probably everyone connecting to this issue or this webinar is aware that the whole thinking around this field and the national debate has really moved a lot in the last 15 years, where there's now a very rich discourse about how adult English education training services are really intertwined, and that in addition to folks gaining English skills, there's also the fact that a high school diploma is the minimum for entering many jobs, that some college is really the tipping point for getting a more secure family wage sustaining job. And then also in this kind of last several years, we've really moved into a direct connection between adult ed, education and training services, and immigration policy because of the requirements around the DACA program, and then also the idea that under a potential DREAM Act that we'd be expecting anybody who's trying to make their way to permanent legal status would have completed 2 years of college. So we see a whole convergence here in terms of these systems. So I'll just say, in speaking a little bit about some of the issues that we addressed in our recommendations, we drew from a few major areas of MPI's work. Many of you are aware that we've been publishing on education and training success for first and second generation immigrant and refugee youth in the 16 to 26 age band. We've also published a fair amount, been out there in the field doing research on education and training success for DACA Dream youth. And then we encountered many of you in local consultation sessions we did trying to provide input to the National Action Plan that the Office of Career Technical Adult Ed put out, was engaged in trying to publish last year. It only made it out recently. Also, we have a big interest in the early childhood arena, both immigrant and refugee workers within it, as well as parents of young children. So somewhat quickly, I'll just say the obvious thing, that the need in the system is for these services is extremely high. The capacity is weak. We only meet about 4% of the need for adult basic ed. There's lots of painful cuts that happened during the Great Recession over the last several years that have really hurt some of the provision. Very, very importantly, this came out of so many of our local consultation sessions around PIAC, that you could really see that these services were largely created as a federal system back in the late 60s. There was a very small demand for ESL at the time, and so ESL kind of grew up in the system more stovepiped, and the idea became, and systems organized themselves around the idea that you go for English language instruction first, then you go into basic ed, then you go into training. And so it's really, that sequential model has been very dispiriting, takes way too long for so many folks, and it's also prevented most LEP individuals from accessing training, it appears. Then as we move to sort of the more recent discourse around WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, some of the changes also that are underway in California, I know a lot of folks locally are feeling that they're really caught, that on the one hand they want to see systems move towards more integrated instructional models, but then there's a real fear that the creaming out of lower educated individuals is really going to become even more ferocious, that if we start to say that the more favored outcomes for systems are employment and post-secondary transition, that it's really going to be a disincentive for programs to be taking the time and spending the money to serve people who are both low educated and LEP. Also, we've got so many diverse learners and needs within the population, so trying to figure out how to fit some important populations within mainstream service provision or program designs is really complicated for a lot of folks running these programs. And then also there's very large variations in state policies and investments that really make it hard to try and feel confident about what the reform should be at the federal level. So I'll just say a little bit about some of the recommendations that were in our input to the White House Task Force. The first was just an overall doubling of adult education funds. Many folks had hoped that this would be announced in the President's budget last year because of the findings under PIAC. You know, a lot of folks are hoping that that's within reach. Also, we've had some pretty strong recommendations for a while that we think that there really might be a civil rights problem with the lack of access for LEP individuals to training programs. Usually it's only about in the 5% range in terms of LEPs being able to access training programs, so obviously there's a problem there. A lot of our recommendations, or a good number of them, focus on equitable access for low-educated individuals. We've asked that the subgroup that exists now, there's an interagency working group on career pathways. We've asked that there be a subgroup created within that specifically to look at the access of low-educated individuals to career training programs. And then we also made a number of recommendations on issues at the intersection of immigration and education policy. And a good number of them have to do with youth who are eligible or potentially eligible to apply for DACA. There's a lot of issues. Many of you have been working with us around this in the cross-city working group. Cross-city learning network we've created around these issues. But we've got big problems in terms of the clarity around the eligibility for training services, real disenfranchisement of DACA individuals depending on the state that they live in, and also a lack of clarity about particular services like the Spanish language high school equivalency programs that are a pretty good strategy for some of this population, but really not being implemented in many places. Then I just want to say, because as Ava and Amanda and I divided up content, I just wanted to say something about two special populations that you won't be hearing about otherwise from them. One is we've made, for about a year and a half now, been seeking more effective approaches for parents of young children, with the thought that as adult education and training systems move more towards a focus on post-secondary transition and career pathways, it becomes more and more clear how hard it is for systems to serve parents of young children who are really not usually on a pathway towards those kinds of services, and also that there's a completely different set of services really that we'd like to reach those parents with, those parents who are low educated in LET. So we've called for a large-scale demonstration project for some of what we think are the more effective approaches to meeting the needs of those parents so that they don't have to compete, in a sense, in the new, more employment-focused system that's being built. And then secondly, and this is the last big thought that I want to maybe put on the table, is that a number of us have been talking for a while that, it's very likely if we get immigration reform that within it there would be provisions for or requirements for some sort of language learning of people coming through under a legalization program. We already know that there's several billion hours of unmet need for ESL, and so it seems that we're really not going to be able to meet that sort of large need that might be touched off by an immigration program. And at the same time, we know that we really could probably scale models that make better use of technology to meet that need. So we've asked as part of our recommendations that there be more federal leadership to create a marketplace for those kinds of programs that would have a better chance of making the most of the opportunity for linguistic, economic, civic integration through new program models, rather than just seeking a level gain of maybe, from level 2 to level 3 under the NRS system for people coming through under those programs. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ava Melona. Ava has been the leading voice, I would say, up in Massachusetts and New England around immigration and immigrant integration policy issues for many years now. Not only has she been deeply involved with communities up there, but she's a critical part of the leadership that came together from around the country to create the National Partnership for New Americans. And so I'll give her a chance to talk a little bit about those different hats that she wears before she talks about their recommendations. Ava?
Thank you so much, Margie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you also for the great work that you do in these areas. First, I wanted to thank MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy for hosting this webinar and offer their intellectual leadership in this area, but also recognize Margie's leadership and remarkable contribution in the field. So thank you so much. So with that, I'll start very briefly describing the National Partnership for New Americans and our work, very briefly talking about MIRA, then getting to 4 areas of recommendations. NPNA, or the National Partnership for New Americans, that I co-chair, was incorporated formally in 2010, creating a voice for immigrants in the work and welcoming democracy for all and economic and linguistic and civic integration for new Americans, and really has become a leading national voice for immigrant integration policy and advocacy at both state and federal level. Our annual National Integration Conference brings together stakeholders from policy world, academia, community-based groups, and government, and many areas. In July 2014, along with Welcoming America, we also convened the first national symposium on immigrant integration at the White House. Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, which is one of the co-founders of MPNA and the organization that I direct, is the largest entity in New England promoting the rights and integration of immigrants and refugees. We've been around since 1987 with 150 organizational members and do a very wide agenda, work on a very wide agenda at the New England level on policy and advocacy, and have playing, a leading role also with our partners at MPNA through the New Integration Institute, that is the think tank component of MIRA. So in the capacity of NPNA, we also were thrilled about the President's announcement of the White House task force and the call for recommendations. Our 2012 principles of immigrant integration, which were influential in immigration reform legislation that passed by the U.S. Senate in 2013, called for the creation of the White House Office of New Americans to coordinate integration efforts across the federal government and with state government, and that's one of our key advocacy agendas to push forward. We submitted recommendations in 10 areas, including citizenship and naturalization, language access, adult education and workforce training, in the civil rights area, workers' rights, high-skilled immigrant integration, immigrant entrepreneurship, administrative relief, early childhood and care, and health care. For the sake of time, I will only focus on four areas very briefly. The first one that I'll talk about is the high-skilled immigrant integration. This an area that several national partnership partners have devoted attention to, including MIRA, our partners in Illinois and Washington State, through a grant from the J.M. Kaplan Fund. As you may know, nationally 30% of immigrants in the U.S. have a college degree or higher, half of this earned outside the U.S. Yet more than a quarter of these skilled engineers, teachers, nurses, and other professionals are either unemployed or working in low-wage and low-skilled jobs. The barriers here are numerous. I can include a few. A, the complexity of state licensing requirements and the lack of clear information about those requirements. B, lack of targeted workforce development support for this population, and immigrants' own limited English skills and lack of familiarity with U.S. job search process. Much of the policy work here belongs at the state level, but nationally MPNA has called for the Department of Labor, Department of Education, and Health and Human Services to work together with state and local stakeholders to begin to address this and other barriers. This includes, first, better coordinated sharing of information online resources. Second, providing guidance and expanding the capacity of the federally funded workforce development system, including one-stop career centers, in providing targeted services for this population. Third, federal agencies should also work with states and professional bodies to create a more streamlined national system for transferring credentials and relicensing, as in Canada and the European Union. And finally, the federal government can provide support to states and localities through matching grants and technical support that help meet the needs of states and local labor markets and address workforce diversity goals. And we in Massachusetts produced really the first credentialing report that maybe I'll be happy to talk at a later time, but we came up with concrete recommendations that we hope, among other partners at MPNA, could become a model on this particular issue. The second area that I will touch on is the early childhood education and care workforce. MPNA's recommendations also addressed in this area. With a quarter of children under 6 nationally living in immigrant families, this is a particularly critical issue. These children are far less likely than native-born children to participate in center-based early education programs and in turn to gain the benefits that these programs offer in terms of children's school readiness and system engagement that can help entire families. Both the federal government and states are investing considerable resources in expanding ECEC services and improving system quality. The unintended consequence of rising academic requirements for child care workers, however, is to limit career options for the growing number of immigrants and limited English proficient workers and providers in the field. This population is now 18% of the ECEC workforce and represents a key component of the linguistic and cultural competence that is increasingly in demand by the ECEC system. So in terms of recommendations here, too much of the work, again, has to take place at the state level. But the federal government, particularly the Office of Child Care, Department of Education, and the Department of Labor can take leadership in planning and designing of professional development systems that will retain the skills and competencies that immigrants ECEC workforce bring to the field. This focus should also be part of a broader effort at the federal level to expand access to ECEC services for minority and low-income families. MPNA calls on the federal government to convene an interagency working group to address gaps in training and linguistic and cultural competence in the ECEC workforce. This initiative should address in particular the lack of integrated adult education and career pathway programs targeting needs of lower educated and LEP workers. This includes providing grants to states and financial incentives for minority and immigrant family-based providers and child care workers to increase their skills and also increase their academic qualifications. The next issue is the use of digital technology and adult education. This represents an innovative approach to strengthening the capacity of an underfunded adult education system, a system that meets only a fraction of the need and demand for English classes among limited English proficient immigrants. Increasingly sophisticated instructional technology and wide availability of the broadband and tablet computers, and other mobile devices provide an opportunity to pilot effective and scalable models for using technology-supported instructions to meet the educational and digital literacy needs of these populations. Such programs will be especially critical in the event of future immigration reform legislation that requires a minimum level of English proficiency as a condition for permanent legal status. MPNA has recently received a $2.5 million grant from Gates Foundation to work with our partner organizations in implementing such a program with a focus on DACA eligible adults. And the fourth area I wanted to touch on is the engagement in ECEC program by immigrant parents of young children. So our recommendations looked at immigrant parent engagement in the ECEC programs, and this issue was also subject of the 2013 research collaboration that MPI and 6 MPNA partners, including MIRA, participated, including Florida, New York, California, Washington State, and Illinois. So research clearly supports the positive impact of strong partnership between families and early childhood programs for both children and families as a whole. But as with access to ECEC services in general, foreign-born parents face many challenges to meaningful participation in family engagement activities. One is the lack of linguistic and cultural competency among the program themselves. Another is the shift of adult education programs away from the family literacy and towards high school completion and post-secondary transitions. This has left both parents and ECEC programs without partners and adult education system to build connections. Our recommendations at the federal level include first, leveraging existing federal funding streams to strengthen the financial incentives and program accountability for parent engagement efforts focused on immigrant families, especially under Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And the second is through Department of Health and Human Services and Education, developing a large-scale pilot parent engagement initiative that serves the unique needs of low literate and LEP parents of young children. This can draw on promising models at the federal and state and local levels, including Head Start programs, to develop effective and scalable program approaching. So in closing, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time and for your attention, and thank again MPI for coordinating the webinar and for the remarkable work that they do, and I look forward to any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ava. And I do, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about the complexity of this whole undertaking at the federal level for two reasons, both thinking with what you were saying, the deep dive in a sense you did on your concerns in the early childhood education and care field, you know, that could be its own whole webinar because there are so many kind of cross-cutting issues there. And that's sort of its own silo in terms of all the federal programming, and yet it cuts over into these adult education and training issues so clearly. But then also, and maybe we can talk more about this in the question and answer period, is that there's the role of the different levels of government, and Massachusetts, partly or largely with pushing from MIRA and your work, has really done some great work in trying to have the state government be more coordinated in terms of having a cross-cutting approach to integration. And that is one of the big, I would say one of the areas of focus for the Domestic Policy Council and USCIS right now, is trying to figure out how to make sure that there are really big, the state and local government partners are a big part of the conversation around this. So let me next turn this over to Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, who is a senior policy analyst with the National Skills Coalition. Many of you may know Amanda from her work earlier at the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians. She was a real leading voice in the field, doing a lot of cutting-edge work there, looking at employment training and supports that would help different types of immigrants make the best use of their talents and really make their way in the workforce. She was a very important figure in starting up Imprint, which is a collaboration of a number of groups that came together to really push forward some of the work around higher educated immigrants. And now we're just delighted that she's joined the National Skills Coalition, which is such an important voice in terms of federal policy around education and training issues, and that she's really bringing so much perspective to that important national work, such important perspective related to immigrant integration issues. So Amanda, great to have you, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Margie, for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you to MPI for bringing us all together here on this webinar today. As Ava said, it's really galvanizing to have so much attention on these issues at this moment. It's a moment of high public attention around immigration, as we see with the DHS funding fight in Congress, but it's also a really exciting moment around practitioner sort of implementation of several important things. So I'm going to give a little big picture context, and then I'm going to talk a bit about my organization and the recommendations that we've made and how those might fit into the work that many of you in the field are doing, may already be engaged in, and may be able to be engaged in the future. So the National Skills Coalition, you can see our vision here on screen. We are a 15-year-old nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., with coalition members all over the country. Several thousand organizational members as well as individual members, all focused on organizing, advocating, and communicating the importance of a good skills policy. And that is for every worker across every industry in the U.S. economy. That includes immigrant workers, that includes entry-level workers, that includes higher skilled or incumbent workers. It includes, of course, low-wage workers, particularly those who are keenly interested and eager to advance and want to access the training programs that allow them to do so. So Margie has already talked very eloquently about the fact that the existing infrastructure at the federal level to support adult education and workforce is limited in terms of being able to meet all of the need that exists. So I'm going to focus my remarks on a couple of key areas that are of urgent interest to the field because of some deadlines that are coming up. And for those of you who work in the arena of workforce, some of these will be familiar. If you work in the area of immigrant rights or immigrant organizing, some of them may be less familiar. I'll also talk about some immigration aspects that may be less familiar to those of you whose focus is adult education or workforce. So there are two coinciding events that are happening this spring. There's the implementation of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, known as WIOA, and then there is the simultaneous implementation of the Immigration Executive Actions. And I love that Margie called the integration memo the sleeper issue. I absolutely think that that's what it is. There were a whole series of memos from the President and from the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security in November, focusing on everything from entrepreneurship to the integration memo to DACA and DAPA. And of course, we have the White House Task Force, and as Margie mentioned, the task force will be generating its recommendations to the President towards the end of this month. So what is this moment of opportunity? I think one of the key things to realize is that Congress actually passed the WIOA legislation in overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. And that's fairly notable because, as you may have noticed, there haven't been a lot of things lately that Congress has passed in overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. And that legislation that got passed at the end of last summer is really getting implemented beginning now this year. And there's a few key moments of opportunity that are coming together. Because National Skills Coalition is a coalition, and because we develop our advocacy priorities in conversation with our members, that's exactly what we did around the immigrant integration work that we've been doing. Speaking to our members in the field and gathering their input and recommendations about how they'd most like to see us prioritize this work given this moment of opportunity with the simultaneous implementation. And there are 4 principles that our recommendations fall under. I'm going to zip through them fairly quickly. I had linked earlier on Twitter, and I know Margie has also sent out the link in the email to this webinar, the page on the MPI website that contains all of the White House Task Force recommendations, including those from National Skills Coalition. You can read more about this there. Our first principle is that, the issues of both sets of stakeholders should be addressed, that is both employers and workers. The second principle is that we support the alignment, collaboration, and shared accountability in the provision of adult English language acquisition and basic skills instruction. Our third guiding principle in developing our recommendations is that we support the vital role of community-based networks and community-based service providers as a bridge into the public workforce system. And I know that many of you today are working in community-based organizations. And our fourth principle is around addressing the plurality of skill levels and employment goals of individuals that are impacted by changes to immigration policy. And you've already heard a bit about this from Ava in her discussion of immigrants with college degrees from abroad who may be employed in low-wage jobs. You heard about it in the discussion of the DACA applicants or potential DACA applicants who need to build their English language proficiency, perhaps through the English Innovations Program. Those are our guiding principles. I'm going to talk briefly about some select recommendations, and then we'll get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So the first thing is that there are two upcoming deadlines that are particularly relevant for those of us working in the immigrant integration field. One is that this spring there'll be the opportunity for public comment on the draft regulations for the new WIOA legislation. And the second is that each state is required under WIOA to develop a unified plan, a unified statewide plan for their implementation of WIOA. And so our particular recommendations center around two things. The first, making sure that the draft WIOA regulations do not unnecessarily exclude immigrants from participation in career training. So, for example, making sure that performance measures don't create incentives for organizations not to serve people who have low basic skills or who have limited English proficiency. And there'll be an opportunity this spring, and hopefully many of you are already on the National Skills mailing list, but if you're not, you'll get an email from us with sample comments to be able to submit your own public comment on this important issue. And the second issue is around the unified planning. These plans are due from the states to the federal government in March of 2016, and the planning process is already getting underway in many places. Our recommendation here centers around ensuring that immigrant-serving organizations are part of those planning discussions, because we think it's critically important that the voice of those who are working with and serving immigrants be heard at the policymaking table as states are making their decisions. The next set of recommendations focused on the importance of integrated education and skills training programs. Many of you may be familiar with the IBEST model, nationally known since it started in Washington State and has now spread to a number of other states. As a national model and a very strong one for serving immigrants, Margie talked earlier about the stovepipe problem, that people with limited English might be expected to spend a significant amount of time in English language programs before being allowed into career training programs. IBEST does away with that and focuses on the importance of integrated training, sometimes with a dual instructor model. And we think that and similar models are important to lift up and emphasize good sector partnerships and employment-focused adult basic education and ESOL. So those are areas where there's a great deal of interesting innovation happening at the state and community level, and we would like to see those models lifted up and replicated more by other states and other localities. Another issue that we made a recommendation on is one that may be very familiar to those of you who spend a lot of time in ESOL classrooms, and that is the fact that there's a gap between the community-based ESOL classes often provided with federal funding and the college-level ESOL classes that may be the next step for a lot of people. It's often the case that a learner might test out of the community-based classes and yet not be ready for college. So our recommendation is really to think as creatively as possible about alternative funding mechanisms, alternative models to ensure that those learners don't test out of their friendly community-based organization and then get frustrated or discouraged when they're not immediately able to make a bridge into a college classroom. And then our final recommendations that I'm going to be highlighting today focused on the importance of really amplifying the existing exemplar programs and the existing resources that are out there, whether that's curricula for ESOL classes OSHA has curricula around worker safety training. There's curricula from the Department of Education. There's curricula funded through the Department of Labor. Whether that's improving the online federal resources available, many of you may be familiar with the leap forward that's been made by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in offering better resources for the Citizenship Resource Center on their website. So there's a host of ways in which this could be done, and our recommendations do talk about that in more depth. But we think that that's a really fruitful area as these two big pieces of policy move forward, the implementation of WIOA and the deferred action piece. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. You can see on the screen other ways for you to be connected to National Skills Coalition. I do encourage you to sign up for our email list so that you may be notified of these key moments in WIOA implementation where you can chime in and make your voice heard. And with that, you can see my contact information on the screen here. I'm going to turn it back over to Margie to do some Q&A.
Great. Amanda, thanks so much. I really liked the National Skills Coalition recommendations, well, for all sorts of reasons, but not least of which was the way you were very broad gauge in terms of how you talked about the opportunities under implementation of the new Workforce Act. And, you know, did a deep dive on some particular areas, you know, similar to what Ava was talking about with some of her examples. But then that you really looked at what's already out there. I thought it was such a great point that there's an awful lot out there that never gets collected, you know, that we move on very quickly from different programs and things that get funded and don't ever have the opportunity to really learn from a lot of the different experiments that get funded at the federal level or the resources that get created. So I thought it was you know, a great kind of piece of advice there in what you all submitted. So we do have a number of questions that have been submitted. We'll start getting to them right now, but so I wanted to sort of reframe one and pitch it to Amanda first. But first, let me say one of the questions was just a basic definitional one about new Americans, and did it include both immigrants and refugees? Was it all foreign-born? Did it include the undocumented? So I just wanted to say that generally, the way that term is used and the way it's used in this process, new Americans, is all of the foreign-born, regardless of their immigration status. So it's normally taken to mean immigrants, refugees, and including those who are unauthorized. I'll just say, though, that in MPI's work, we've tried hard, both in the New American Success Act work and also with our recommendations here, to keep including children of immigrants and young children of immigrants and refugees, with the idea that even if those children are U.S. born, which many of them are, so that they're technically not immigrants, the fact that their parents have to that they have to rely on their parents to navigate any kind of services or navigate their way in the society, that they really should be included in the way we look at these the work of the Task Force on New Americans and what might come via future legislation. So that's kind of just a personal take on it, or an institutional take on it from MPI, you know, but generally I would say that when we say new Americans, we're talking about all of the foreign-born, all first-generation immigrants. So Amanda, quite rightly, a lot of what you talked about was how this really important opportunity with implementation of the new Workforce Act is proceeding side by side with this work around the New Americans Task Force, and I know that, you know, a lot of the folks who are thinking about the one are also involved in implementing the other. So we had a lot of recommendations in our input also that related to what we thought were opportunities to solve some of these problems under the new legislation. But I would say that, at least to our mind, one of the really big challenges that everyone's going to face with the way the law is written is that it just doesn't seem like it's going to be possible to to do everything that the law envisions. You know, that on the one hand it's saying that that there's going to be expanded access to employment, training, education, support services with folks who have barriers to employment, including low levels of literacy and English proficiency. And at the same time, it really looks like when you have this more coordinated accountability structure, the focus on employment outcomes, on post-secondary transition, that they're almost impossible things for folks to balance at the local level. You know, that you really can't have a system be all things to all people if you barely have enough, you know, services for even a small fraction of them. So, so beyond saying, you know, one of the things that we said in our recommendations was, well, you know, the Departments of Education and Labor really need to provide explicit support and guidance for all the local, you know, workforce development boards, governors, state agencies that are developing these state plans about how they're going to do that. I'm just curious, since we've had a few questions that are talking about how does one make sure that there's some sort of accountability for working with lower educated people. They might be in rural areas, you know, they might be, or they, you know, they, on the other end of the spectrum, they might be high-skilled people living in more urban areas, you know, but how do you see, what do you see as actions that either folks who are here on the call or folks who are involved in actual implementation, how do they balance these two things, and are there any of your recommendations that have to do with how the federal government could help agencies find a way to really kind of thread this needle?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. That's a great, great point. And of course, Congress laid out a very ambitious vision in this, I think, 800 and some page piece of legislation, but where the rubber really meets the road is often in the regulation stage and in the planning stage. So I think there's a couple things. First and foremost, our recommendation number one, and it was recommendation number one for a reason, was to maintain the funding amounts in the current year and to work to increase funding in future years to the full level that's authorized under the WIOA legislation, because, as you've correctly noted, there are so many ways in which the system really needs additional resources to even begin to meet the needs in different communities. And then the second issue is really around performance measures. And there are different tools, and I'm not going to go into too much nitty-gritty right here on the webinar, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone who has a specific interest afterwards in email. There are specific tools such as regression analysis that can mitigate some of those tendencies that might occur in the system that would cause, for example, it to be less likely for service providers to want to serve people with limited English proficiency or people with limited education. So, but in order for those mechanisms to be implemented and for those mechanisms to sort of protect against immigrants getting shut out of receiving services, people on the ground need to be paying attention, and people on the ground need to chime in and weigh in, both to tell federal policymakers whether their draft regulations are going to unintentionally do that, and to really be the eyes on the ground for the local implementation to say, well, here's how it's actually playing out on the ground. And so we do encourage people both to make sure that their local policymakers are aware of what are often the very interesting and innovative things that they're doing. We've talked earlier in the webinar about the English innovations. There's work being done. Ava mentioned the 3 projects in Illinois, Washington State, and Massachusetts around immigrant professionals, and really educating local workforce systems about the wisdom that immigrant-serving organizations already have in terms of effectively serving this population is also part of getting people over the hump of, well, you know, I'm gonna look at this worker or this learner and see first all the barriers they have instead of seeing first the opportunity that they represent. So there are some clear, immediate steps that can be taken, but then there's also a sort of constant watchfulness or alertness that I think will always need to be in place to make sure that the system, which is huge and expansive, you know, doesn't overlook any of the special populations, whether that's veterans or immigrants or whomever it's trying to serve.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So, Ava, we have a few questions that I think would be good for you to broadly address. There's a very specific one about the NPNA conference and when exactly is it. So I don't know if you have the dates for it. But then there's also a few questions about, first of all, how can folks get more connected to some of these efforts, and it's, you know, there's questions both at the state and the national level in that regard. So it seems like given NPNA's membership, that might be a way for folks to, you know, to connect to efforts at the state level. And then also, in many ways, I think where folks have more the experience and the capacity to really speak about what needs to happen on immigrant integration is really at the state or local level. And so I thought if you could just give a quick snapshot of the work that you organized in Massachusetts with the state government in order to give folks a way to connect to that might be a good model to answer some of the questions folks had about how to build more capacity around integration issues where they are.
Thank you so much. So the conference, the 8th NIC conference, will take place in November 2015 in New York City. We don't have the exact date, but we know it's going to be in November and it's going to be in New York City, so stay tuned for the save the date. It will go out as soon as the details are finalized. In terms of the question about how to connect with NPNA, I just wanted to emphasize that NPNA is composed of 34 immigrant organizations, 12 state coalitions, the co-founders, and we do work across 29 states. Our executive director is Joshua Hoyt, who travels across the country and is a remarkable national leader, so you can connect with us. And we also will be doing webinars, and we have regular activities across the country regarding the integration efforts, you know, as we're pushing for all the recommendations that we are making. So you can, I'll be happy to connect you with our policy director, Tara, and also with Josh and the work of the 34 groups that are working with NPNA across the 29 states. Our agendas are very big, and as you heard, you know, in the 10 areas of the recommendations that NPNA submitted, but also in terms of the implementation of the executive order, regardless of the court decision, there are areas, you know, the integration work is something that we can push forward. So we're hoping to work with our partners and connect with all of you, and you can get engaged in the areas that I mentioned, or if you have other interests in other parts of parts of agenda and work, we can connect in that regard as well. And my information is at the end of the PowerPoint that is online. More information is at our website, MPNA's website, and there is also a complete set of recommendations. So look into the areas of recommendations and let us know how we can be of better help. We also are doing a lot of trainings, and we send alerts out to invite and share information, and also open up for more collaborations with all of you. And the third piece, I think Margie mentioned, the state efforts. We have been really active in Massachusetts to get the government, the state level government as well as the city level, to, you know, be part of the effort and be a stakeholder in the effort to push a national integration agenda. In collaboration with MPI a couple of years ago under Governor Patrick. Well, first, let me say that Massachusetts is one of the 4 states in the country that has a new integration agenda. We put together one of the first, most comprehensive reports that look into the ways how to best incorporate immigrants and refugees into the part of the fabric. And it was a wonderful model of an advocacy organization collaborating with the administration and the Massachusetts Office for Immigrants and Refugees to come up with ways to how best incorporate immigrants and refugees. And we had the first national table, you know, that MPI also co-sponsored, when we got our governor and the administration to become a voice at the national level to really recommend as to why is it important at the state level to have that connection and to have that push and that national coordination, and what is the benefits for the state. And we also have done that at the city level. Mayor Walsh of Boston recently submitted a 15-page document to the task force, speaking from the city level. So I cannot emphasize enough the needs and the work that needs to be done to include the government and, into the effort of, as a stakeholder, to really push the agenda forward. The current project in Massachusetts and in Washington State and in Illinois has to do with, the healthcare professionals. So we're looking into, in Massachusetts, a possible executive order to look into the issue. In Washington State, there's pending legislation to deal with licensing for teachers. And in Illinois, there was also another report that highlighted in the areas of engineering and nurses what can be done. And I'll be happy to talk offline with people who are interested as to what are some of the specific recommendations at the state level that could become a model for a national program of this sort.
Great, thanks, Ava. So we have a few questions that have to do with understanding what resources might be there locally, and and kind of more general navigation of adult ed and training resources that are out there. And I'll just say that this is an issue that has come up a lot in the learning network that MPI sponsors. Right now there's 5 geographic areas of the country that are part of it. We're soon going to expand to 10. But that network focuses on education and training success for DACA Dream Youth. And the reason that we've engaged in that is with the idea that it's pretty likely that if there is immigration reform, that the primary group that would be privileged in that, I guess, and be most likely to have a pathway to citizenship would be those who arrived here as children. And but there may be a pretty stiff requirement about completing 2 years of college within a pretty short period of time. And so we're working with folks who are in education systems, workforce training systems in these localities, trying to figure out how to have a more effective and coordinated approach. And I just have to say that time and again, all of you who are asking for this as part of the questions, there really aren't good navigation resources locally. And part of the problem is that even if one created a directory, that there's a big problem with upkeeping a directory, because so often, classes exist for a short period of time, then they're discontinued. And it's very hard if you're a student, you don't want to go to a sort of one-room schoolhouse ESL class. If you're someone who's got professional training as a physician assistant or as a dentist, to be in a garden variety EL civics class isn't going to work for you. And if very often we find that a lot of young men, as they look at and there's a lot of young men in the potential DACA population who haven't come forward yet, who need to enroll in education classes, but looking at what are the traditional lists sometimes of ESL classes, they just don't appeal because they're already employed and looking for programs that would help them advance in their employment. People, a lot of folks really need some navigation assistance, some counseling, and if they were enrolling in community college, there'd be a lot of those supports, but there's not that kind of support in the adult education model. And so I would just say that yes, some directories exist, but it's when you're trying to help folks really be on a pathway that includes education and training as well as language, it's a hard thing to do just with a directory. And so I think there's a pretty sophisticated discourse in a number of localities trying to figure out how to solve that problem. And for any of you that are kind of involved in trying to solve that problem locally, if you're not connected with us in those efforts, we'd welcome you to be. So with that, there are a few questions that we didn't get to. We'll try and answer them via email. But for now, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to Ava Melona and Amanda Bergson-Shilcock for their great presentations. and for putting me to shame with their much nicer slides than what I had. I really have to get into using pictures, apparently. Please, if you haven't seen it yet, a lot of information is there on our website. That's the first bullet you see on this slide. We have 2 more webinars coming up that are going to delve into particular other issue areas that are key parts of the conversations that are happening around the White House Task Force. The next one will be on economic development and refugee resettlement issues, so you can register for that online. The third one will be addressing broad issues related to creation of an integration success fund, language access issues, as well as some of the efforts of state and local governments. So we welcome you to join us for those. And in the meantime, just thanks very much for joining us today. And we hope this has been helpful to you, and we'd love to receive any additional feedback you may have. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.